Hello.
Hello everyone, and we are delighted to be starting up a new series of Invisible Histories talks. And we'd like to say thank you particularly to our trustee Maxine Peake for introducing us to today's speaker, Lisa Mckenzie. Lisa's work relates to class inequality, social justice and British working class culture, so she's definitely in the right place. Our events are, as usual, free, and we would like to encourage you, however, if you're able to support the library, and there is a donate button on our website. But now, without further ado, over to you, Lisa.
Thank you. Well, yeah, just first of all, thank you, Lynette, for inviting me, and thank you to Maxine for suggesting it, and thank you for everybody who's turned up today. I'm not sure about the Zoom thing, I'm not sure whether it works better than being in person or not, but I think it's interesting now that, that we can be all over the world and start to share our stories, which is important for me as a working class woman, that, working class people all over the world get to speak to each other about our shared experiences, because cultures may change, but working class experiences tend to have similarities all over the world. So I think Zoom, it does take some of that personal feel out of talking and sharing stories, but also it allows us to speak to a much wider audience, which is also always a good thing. When you don't belong to the institutions of power that decide who gets to talk and whose stories get to be heard, which is really what I wanted to talk about today. So I'll introduce myself a little bit. So my name is Lisa Mckenzie. I am a sociologist. I currently work at Durham University as a lecturer in sociology. But that doesn't really explain everything that I am. I'm a working class woman. I grew up in a council estate in Sutton-in-Ashfield in North Nottinghamshire. I call myself a working class academic. It's important that I do that because, I don't know, up until perhaps 10, 15 years ago, to say that you were a working class academic, was a ridicule and a nonsense. I mean, it still is in some places. And I do have to defend myself by calling myself a working class academic, because for a lot of people who are in academia, those two things don't go together. Being working class and being an academic doesn't go together. There's an idea that once you go to university, you no longer can be working class. And the only reason I can ever make out for that is because there's an assumption that working class people can't read books. So for me, it's important on my own political basis that I call myself a working class academic, because you can read books, because you engage in academic debate, because you're a critical thinker, and even because you work at a university, does not mean that you are now middle class. I don't see myself as middle class. I never have done, I never will do. And I suppose the presentation, or the talk I'm going to give today, might give some insights into that. Just to bear in mind, I'm not an historian. I am a sociologist and I am a working class woman. So my sense of history is not perhaps come from, linear timelines and sort of books. It comes through storytelling and experiences through my last 20 years of being a working class academic, interviewing and working with working class people, and predominantly working class women, but also a lifetime, 52 years of being a working class woman. So it's not necessarily, you might say, the Industrial Revolution, didn't come at this particular time. But what I'm trying to do here is give an overview of how I see the ritual monstering of working class women over history, right up until the present day, and in my opinion will continue into the future. I can't see, in a quite negative sense, I don't see, especially in the UK, the conversation about class inequality and class prejudice and classism being on a public agenda anytime soon. So hopefully, the little bits that we say and the arguments that we make, and hopefully places like the Working Class Movement Library that offers a space for these conversations, I think we need to make the most of them, open them up and push those conversations and those storytellings and those narratives about what it is to be working class today and possibly in the future, as well as as in the past. So I'm going to share my screen now. What I didn't want to do is death by PowerPoint, and I think I've probably done that. So, if you don't want to see the PowerPoint, that's fine. But I thought, for my own thinking and to keep myself in time, I've done a PowerPoint. So my conversation today with you all really is about the ritual monstering of working class women, and it's something that I want to move over, okay, and it's something that obviously I've noticed on a personal level the whole of my life. It's something that has come through narratives through working class women in my own family, through the women in my family, through women I've worked with in factories and in shops, through the interviews that I've done in my work with working class women all over the country now, but also through the reading that I've done as an academic, but also the reading that I've done just as an interested person. So I'm going to start really with, I suppose, the theoretical idea of working class and what I mean by the working class woman in the context that I'm going to talk about today. I'm very much an E.P. Thompson type of theorist in how I see that the working class is made. It's not a natural category. None of us are born naturally to be working class and to be humping big pieces of coal around, or scathing off all the corn in the fields, or building the boats. None of us, I would say, is naturally equipped to do that type of work. So as E.P. Thompson showed in his brilliant book, that the working class, the English working class in particular, was made. It's the making of the working class through the conditions of capitalism and the capitalist system. And so for me, that's where I'm going to start, the making of the working class body. And then I'm going to move on to the making of the woman's working class body. So for me, the making of the working class body is the body of burden. We could argue we still are the donkey of the human race. We are the people that do the work, we do the graft, we do the physical graft. Our job in a capitalist system is not to do the thinking, it's not to do the writing, it's not to do, the politics or the critical ideas of society. Our job is to do the lumping about, the making of things, the lumping, the heavy work. And so the working class body has been narrated in that way. The body of burden, the body that digs, the body that sows, the body that makes things. The working class man's body has often been talked about, as hyper-masculine, muscular, rough and ready. And I think rough and ready has always been two words that has gone together, particularly with the research that I've done over 20 years. Because when you talk to working class women, I always remember talking to some women in Nottingham in St Anne. And one of the things that, you know, they did say to me is, as a working class woman, they think that we're rough and ready. And those two words, rough and ready, always comes out. So what does rough and ready mean? Ready to work, ready for action, ready to have sex, ready. Rough, perhaps the hardness of the body, but also the cultural roughness of manners. And so what I've got here is I've just found some photographs, some images. It always fascinates me, the way that working class women's bodies been narrated and changed according to what capitalism needs from us. And so these are women's bodies down the pit, down the mines in the 18th century. And you can see through the pictures that the women's jobs was usually the lumping around. When the seams were very low, they used children and women as the donkeys, because the donkeys couldn't get into the low seams, to sort of drag out the coal. So some of the images there is women and children dragging out coal. But then the last image, the third image, is of a woman miner who's actually digging out. And again, the rule was that the women and even children were put in the lowest seams just because they were smallest. Because of the heat, miners, whether they were men, women or children, would often mine naked. And actually it was one of the reasons why the Victorian philanthropists campaigned against women going down the pit, was because the moral idea that there would be men and women naked in close proximity was actually more offensive to them than people working down the pit without any what we'd call now PPE. So what we also started to, what I also think about working class people's bodies throughout capitalism, and even now as well, if you think about the Amazon warehouse workers, and if you think about the Sports Direct workhouses, I call them workhouses because that's what they are. Our bodies became extensions of the machinery. So some of us, our bodies were, part of the digging and the lumping process. Some of our bodies were the extension of the machinery. We were on production lines. So therefore, and I didn't realise this until I went to university myself, because at 16 I left school with no qualifications and I went to work at Pretty Polly making tights with my mum and all my aunties and all my family and neighbours, all the women. And I was making tights, only I wasn't making tights. What I was doing is feeding a machine. And it wasn't until I actually got to university and I started to think. I'd heard about Marx, I've even read a bit about Marx as a teenager. Didn't really understand it that much until I went to university and I started to think about alienation, and particularly alienation from my own labour. And that's when I realised, as a factory worker at Pretty Polly, because I worked there for 10 years, I'd never actually made a pair of tights. My role was this tiny bit in the middle where I just fed a machine. Therefore, after 10 years, I still didn't know how to. I could not have made a pair of tights myself. And that was for me exactly how I was alienated from my own labour. And so again, this is the other thing that I start to think about around working class women's experience of their own bodies, but also the experience of how we work in society. We're completely alienated, really, from our own hopes, our own skills, or anything that we hope we might achieve, because the system means that we can only ever excel in one tiny part. And for me, it was about feeding a machine. And then, of course, you've got motherhood. And one of the other things about working class women's bodies is we are the producers of the next workers. So our bodies reproduce the next worker too. And here again, I've got some old pictures of, you know, children working in the mills in Lancashire, you know, and then the sort of typical working class family. And so out of women's bodies become children, come the next set of workers. And again, in a capitalist system, that's what working class women are. Their bodies are used to reproduce the next generation of workers, and our bodies are a body of burden. Not ever people in our own rights. Now, sometimes that all goes wrong. And so in any sort of system, you've got your economic system, but society is society, and people are, you know, and people do have agency. Even working class people who are tied to machines, we do have our own agency, and we have to find our own freedoms, and we have to find our own ways of coping with that alienation. And so things often go wrong. For us, it may not be, it's not going wrong for us, it's our way of resilience and resistance. But if you are part of the capitalist class and you're middle class, what goes wrong is perhaps when we don't, you know, our motherhood becomes under question. And you've got many images in history, you know, where you've got Hogarth's gin lane of the bad mother drinking gin. You know, these are the warning signs of what happens if you don't keep the working class under control, and particularly working class women's bodies under control. You know, you've got, obviously, we're always blamed as well for the new generation of yob, because it is the women's body that those yobs came out of. So whether it's the yob, the hoodie, the hooligan, the rioter, the teenage mother, whichever moral panic each generation has, it's the working class mothering that is blamed for that, because it's out of those working class women's bodies that this came. And then the other thing I just wanted to draw attention to again, which is another old narrative that is connected to working class women, to working class women's bodies, is that of dirt and disease and violence. And again, working class women's bodies have always been known as carriers of dirt and disease. And the last picture on this slide is a sort of reenaction of the discovering of one of the bodies from one of the Jack the Ripper victims. And again, those women's bodies were narrated as bodies of dirt, of disease, and of criminality. And so what I just wanted to do with this sort of little bit of section is sort of set up where I want to go with my arguments, because the ritual monstering of working class women does not happen in a vacuum of today or in the context of today. It's historical. And, you know, many of you here are historians, and so you'll know that. So trying to tackle a contemporary issue without understanding the historical context, for me, is counterintuitive. You can't do it. So what I do is, I think it's really important for us to look back and understand the history of working class women's bodies when we start to think about how those bodies are then narrated today. I love this picture because it brings us up to my interest, which is around, you know, the cultural denigration of women, working class women. Because and this is where, when I was an undergraduate at University of Nottingham, I came across Beverly Skegg's work, Bev Skeggs, where her book was about respectability and class. And what she argued is that the working class woman's experience, body, life, existence, is that is naturally not attuned to respectability. whereas the middle class woman's life, body, existence naturally is attuned to respectability. So therefore, if a working class woman wants to gain this idea of respectability, it's something that she must work at, and she can or cannot, she may or may not achieve it. Whereas the middle class woman's body and experience is connected to respectability, and it's almost like hers to lose. So she can lose that respectability, but she's naturally attuned to it through society's, you know, cultural references. And so I really like this picture of the crinoline. So, you know, on one side you've got, you know, the fragrant women, you know, of the Victorian middle class in their crinolines, you know, sitting and holding flowers and perhaps talking about, you know, marriage and Mr. Darcy, etc., etc. And then on the other side, you've got this working class woman's body full of burden, aping, you know, the middle class respectability, sensibility and fragrancy of the crinoline, only it doesn't work for her because it gets in the way of her burden. It gets in the way of her heavy work. And this was a cartoon in Punch, which was actually, it wasn't showing working class women's burden. It was actually laughing at, you know, why would working class women or the common woman, you know, why would they think that they could ape, you know, real women? Because if they tried to put on a crinoline, look what would happen to them. So this is not, you know, this is not showing, you know, this is not a kind depiction of a working class woman. It's laughing at her, you know, that she's trying to ape and she's getting it all wrong. Because, you know, ridiculously, she thinks she's going to wear a crinoline and she's got it wrong and she's got her 2 buckets. We can bring this right up to date in the way that working class women are still ridiculed today. And this is where, and I use these television programs strongly in all my classes at whatever university I'm teaching at, in order to start to think about the way culturally working class women are known through the media, but also known through society, and also how normal it seems and how not outrageous at all it is. So we've got Vicky Pollard here, and this is a character that I have hated for a long, long time. It's Matt Lucas, you know, white, privately educated, middle class man, laughing at and encouraging the rest of us to laugh at a working class girl child. It's not a woman, this is a child. She's supposed to be 13, and these are all her children. There's several, I've campaigned for years and years to get rid of this. And I think recently there has been some acknowledgement that the Little Britain, and not just the Little Britain stuff, but, you know, many of the ways that we're invited to laugh at people is not right. I mean, dressing up in blackface now is not tolerated and it's not right. Dressing up as poor face, or as they say, chav face, doesn't seem to be as outrageous. And in fact, I've had students recently tell me that there are now Instagram apps that you can use, you can put on your own photographs, and it's called chav face. And what it does, it superimposes terrible makeup onto your own face, because that's the way that we imagine working class women to look. The other picture is of Mrs. Bouquet. I'm always a bit more sympathetic to Mrs. Bouquet in Keeping Up Appearances. And that's because what are we actually laughing at with Mrs. Bouquet? With Little Britain, we are laughing at the lack of moral fibre amongst working class people. We're laughing at the over-sexualized body, the ugly body of working class girls. With Mrs. Bouquet, what we're actually laughing at is we're laughing at her ability to get it wrong. And this is what Bev Skeggs says, that working class women can try to be respectable, and that means being middle class. But to the middle class trained eye, they're always going to get it wrong. And I think that's what Mrs. Bouquet does. She comes from a poor working class background. She's got a working class family that she's kind of loves, but also ashamed of. And she's always, and she notes the cultural cues of what it's like to be middle class. You know, she wants to shop at John Lewis, and she wants the royal crest to be shown on the delivery when it gets delivered to her house. But she gets it wrong because she tells everybody to look out for these cues. And we all know that the real middle class wouldn't do that. And so what we're laughing at Mrs. Bouquet getting this wrong. This, as I always tell my students, is very Bourdieusian. So if you've not heard of Pierre Bourdieu, he's a French sociological theorist that I teach and that I write about quite a lot. And he wrote a book called The Distinction of Taste. And so class is not just about the economic situation of people's lives, it's also about the cultural, the way that we judge and hold account for culture as well. This image always makes me laugh, actually, is the Burberry. You know, what happens when working class women, again, it's the same image as the crinoline. On one side, you've got the real middle class doing it right, and then you've got Danielle Westbrook with head to toe in Burberry, apparently doing it wrong. We don't know why she's doing it wrong and the other side's doing it right, only that class culture says that one is tasteful and one is not. The tasteful one is the one that is on the middle class body. The distasteful one is on the working class body. So now I'm going to get to the monstering of working class women. Every year, I can't wait for Aintree, just because I love the images that come out in the media the next day. So one side we've got so this is Ladies' Day, but at two different races. On one side, all in white, we've got Ladies' Day at Ascot, and on the other side, we've got Ladies' Day at Aintree. And again, this is where the monstering of working class women always is. It's about working class women's bodies, it's about working class women's education, it's about working class women's sexuality, their reproduction of the next generation and what they might look like. For me, I've got many stories that I'd rather tell about working class women. And I just thought I'd just sort of throw a few stories out there. I've got two pictures here. One is the women at the London School of Economics. They were cleaners, and they were fighting and on strike for equal pay. This is Mildred. I mean, I used to work with her. She was my colleague, and she had the brilliant saying. And again, it really harps back to this historical, what we think of working class women's bodies and what working class women do. Mildred is a cleaner at the London School of Economics, and one of the things she used to shout at the academics as they used to walk past her picket line was, "I am not the dirt that I clean." And I thought she was brilliant. She went from being told off she was a 60-year-old woman, worked in manual work all her life. Somebody from what sparked off the strike was someone from the LSE reported her because she sat down once. And then that started the strike off. And she ended up being absolutely, you know, she was absolutely stronghold about this, absolutely at the forefront of all this. And, you know, 2 years ago, she got invited to South Africa to go and talk to a women's meeting there. Fantastic woman. This are the stories I want to tell about us, about women from the working class. The other side is a protest outside the Jack the Ripper Museum. For some of us, that Jack the Ripper narrative of the mysterious figure that murders, you know, the Residuum has never gone away. That's me outside the Ripper Museum trying to get it closed down. And again, you know, we never gave up with these stories and we continued with them. I haven't got time really, I don't think. Have I? I've got time, Lynette. No.
I'm sorry, I couldn't unmute myself there. What, you're going to try and run a video? How long is it? You give it a go.
Couple of minutes.
Yeah, go on.
It's just, again, it's just, I just wanted to show. I don't know if I don't even know if it'll happen. Let me just see if it will happen.
Yeah, I can't cut and paste that from here, so it would have to be from your end.
Can you see this?
Not yet.
No, it might not happen. I'm not that great at showing videos at the moment. But anyway, there were two videos there. One of a group of women that I used to work in the factory with at Pretty Polly, and a couple of years ago I went back to Sutton in Ashfield and I did quite a few interviews with the women that I'd worked with in the factory, and we talked about being a middle-aged working class woman now, living in places like Sutton in Ashfield, where we once sewed, made tights, raised families, in places that have been absolutely devastated over the last 30 or 40 years. And so I've got a short video of us all in the pub enjoying ourselves. Narratives, again, that I'd rather tell. The other video was about the Focus E15 women in East London. Again, a group of women that were made homeless. They were actually homeless. They lived in a homeless hostel in East London. The council closed the homeless hostel and made them double homeless, believe it or not. All of them were very young mothers with children under the age of 5, or women who were pregnant. And the other bit, what I can do is give Lynette those clips, and then anybody who wants to see them can see them. And the other video was about the Focus E15 mums and their campaign against their Labour council to try and stop them making them and their children homeless. But again, inspirational working class stories. And the last slide really is just some books and some people that I've used throughout this this talk. There's Steph Lawler's Identity. It's a book that I use for my students, brilliant book about class identity, particularly around culture. There's my book, Getting By, fantastic book, you need to get it. I've got a new book coming out as well, which is about London at some point, whenever. Bev Skeggs and her book Formations of Class and Gender, which I've talked about, and Distinction by Pierre Bourdieu. Again, not always an easy book to read, but if you're interested, it's a, you know, if you're interested in class and culture and the way that distinction of taste works, it's the book to read. So that's it really, that's my presentation. So thank you. Is that all right, Lynette?
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, very happy to pass on the link. If you just send me through that link, then we can put it up on the website. I can also, this recording will be going up on YouTube, so we can put it in the YouTube link as well. So yeah, great, thank you. Plenty for people to talk about. If anybody wants to either wave to me to unmute themselves or put something in the chat. Happy to take questions or comments. Anybody want to? I go back to gallery view. Anybody want to wave at me? Okay, Steve, if you want to unmute yourself, can you do that? I can see you trying. There you go.
Right. Right. Yes, a question for Lisa, please. First of all, I want to support what you were saying about Jack the Ripper. I've done quite a lot of work with history departments in schools, and it does concern me the number of schools who teach unthinkingly really about Jack the Ripper, because they think it will be an interesting subject for schools, for school children to learn about, without really thoroughly examining the implications about the attitudes towards women. So I just want to support that sort of campaign there. Secondly, just perhaps something where I might challenge something that you said, if you don't mind. You talked about the association of working class women and with dirt and disease in the kind of popular narrative. I think there's a kind of counter tradition as well, which is also important, that certainly in late Victorian times and early 20th century, I think you do see a narrative of working class women being very adamant about cleaning their houses, about being very house proud, scrubbing the steps, etc. And I think that comes through in popular culture as well. So I just wondered, you know, is there room for that particular tradition with regard to working class women and dirt and disease and their desire to keep their houses clean, for example?
No, absolutely. No, you're absolutely. Can you hear me? Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. I mean, the dirt and disease is this long historical narrative about working class people. I mean, one of my favourite quotes from George Orwell is that, you know, he said that the real problem that the middle class have with the working class is the 4 frightful words that the working class smell. And I think that obsession, and my mum had it as well, cleaning your nets, making sure you might not have had much inside the house, but on the outside of the house, the step was clean, the windows were clean, the nets were white. Glow white was a proper thing in our house. And it was about the recognition that we are, if we don't do all that hard work, that we are naturally dirty. And so I think that for me is about what that working class. It's also the thing about you know, when we go out, we get dressed up. If you go out on a Saturday night, even still, if you go to working class communities now, Saturday night people they've got the best clothes for going out in, whereas middle class people don't tend to do that so much. But again, it's the acknowledgement of how we are judged and how we are stereotyped if we don't keep up appearances. So I think that's for me where that comes from, because my mum and my grandma was fully aware of their association with dirt and disease if their houses were not clean and tidy, and they judged other women very harshly by that as well, actually. I mean, there's a part in which is brilliant in East is East, where, you know, the woman walks past somebody's house and says, "Clean your bastard windows, you dotty bastard." And again, you know, we judge each other on those standards, but they are standards of which we're judged as well. So I fully agree with that. That's absolutely, doesn't, what I'm saying is, it's not that we are full of dirt and disease, it's that is, if we don't do something about that, that's how we are narrated.
So somebody's asking, Lisa, where do you think nurses come in the grades of what you're talking about?
I mean, that's a sort of difficult question, really, because I mean, nurses, you know, once they put on a uniform, they're part of some, you know, bigger state apparatus or some bigger societal narrative. But I think I always remember, I mean, this is a thing from my own childhood, that there used to be a woman who lived on my street. I used to play with her kids, and they had a wall outside their house on our estate. And I used to sit on the wall, we used to play. And I remember my friend's dad and mum used to always be arguing inside. So you'd hear the noise coming out of the kitchen, and you'd hear domestic violence in the house, and you'd see it as well through the curtain. And the mum was a nurse, and she used to come out in her uniform. And I remember falling off my bike once, and she looked after me and put a plaster on me. And I used to think it was really weird that a nurse would be going to work with black eyes. And I always remember, and I think that's where the disjuncture comes between the working class woman and then, yeah, it's like the same thing as being a working class academic. The two things don't always connect. So, you know, so for the nurse, is she a nurse, or is he a nurse, or are they working class as well? And those things always seem to be pulled out, if you know what I mean. You know, the working class narrative is not of nurses, it's of factory workers. And it is something that those two state ideas of what the working class woman can be, it's a challenging one. I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah, Sue what's a follow-up? You want to unmute yourself, Sue? You need to do it yourself.
Yeah, it was me that asked the question, because my mum and my auntie were both nurses, and they came from a working class background. My two uncles were steel workers, and the tradition kind of went on, I think, because I remember when I was a teenager, I was going out with my mates, and my mother said, "Don't disgrace the family," all in capital letters, as I went out to the front door. So they had that kind of fear of disgracing people, of having to keep up the reputation that working class people do have. And it wasn't till years later that I found out, and my father was from a middle class family. It wasn't till years later I found out she and my dad had lived together before they were married, and she never admitted it. You know, so it's a weird sort of double-edged thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, class. To be a working class woman is a life lived of constant contradiction. And I don't think that is ever acknowledged, actually. The constant contradiction, you know, the narratives that are told about us, the way that we are, you know, we police ourselves and each other, the way that society police us. And then at the same time, I mean, this is what I found out when I was writing my book, Getting By with the Women in St Anne's in Nottingham, is at the same time, we are forced to shame ourselves to the stereotypes in order to survive. So I remember, you know, when I was young and I got my son, you know, you have to tell the social that you don't know who your child's dad is, because it's the only way that they would not pursue them for child support. And actually, for most of us, the only way that we could survive is by, you know, for a start, the only way you get a council house is if you were a single mom. If you'd got a bloke with you who was earning, you wouldn't get a council house. So you had to immediately go, oh, I'm on my own, I'm a single mom. And so these are like the constant contradictions that you're having to live through every frigging minute of your life as a working class woman, from being a working class small child, actually. That you're constant put into these contradictions. On one hand, you need to show that you are worthy and not like the stereotype, but in order to survive, you have to be the stereotype, because that's what people, you know, they believe that of you. Oh yeah, of course they don't know who their kid's dad is. And so I think we should never underestimate the contradiction and complication of being a working class woman. You know, and that's why, you know, my thing at the moment, and Maxine will tell you if she's around, I want our working class, complicated, beautiful stories out there, you know, and not in the sort of sentimental way, but, you know, for all that we are.
There's a lot of interesting comments and things in the chat, and I will forward you the chat afterwards, Lisa, if you haven't got time to read it, because there's lots of good stuff in there. There's a comment from Denise. I'm interested in how working class women are encouraged to use sex, such as in prostitution, and by being sexually alluring as one way to circumvent poverty.
Yeah. I mean, that's not a new thing at all, is it? You know, it's always the same thing as when once we go into recessions, you know, incidents of prostitution rise because women have to survive, and it's you know, it's on the table. You know, I have a complicated relationship with prostitution because, again, as a young woman living in St Anne's growing up, there was a lot of women around me that was involved in prostitution, a lot of family members, a lot of friends, a lot of women involved in sex work. So to me, I recognized it for what it was. It was work, it was about earning money, etc. So I've never really judged women that do that in any particular way, apart from, you know, accept that that's something that they do to make money. But again, it is you know, that old narrative about women, working class women's bodies of being overly sexualized, you know, and then that also comes with overly diseased as well, because one of the big narratives of the Victorian era was that working class women's bodies was full of the pox, and you know, and actually working class women's bodies were often blamed for the failure of men in battles, because they, you know, they'd caught diseases from working class women, from prostitutes. So again, you know, these are complicated and contradictory narratives about women and women's bodies. You know, just because the narrative that working class women are overly sexualized and that they use sex more than middle class women, you know, again, that's just a narrative. Valerie Walkerdine, whose work you should read as well, you know, wrote in the 80s about middle class girls going to university and having abortions. And what she found out is that in the 1980s, where working class women might have had their babies, and so therefore were seen as single mums, teenage mums, middle class girls were getting pregnant at an equal rate, but actually were having abortions because they were going off to university. So again, these are complicated narratives.
Denise, do you want to follow up on that? Do you want to unmute yourself?
Oh, hi. Yeah, no, the reason I was asking that, first of all, when we were talking about disease, I was thinking of the sort of Victorian, before we had treatments for any kind of sexually transmitted disease, working class women who tended to be the women in prostitution were kind of blamed for spreading these diseases, when of course it was the men who was visiting them that were really responsible. But the other thing is, I sometimes, it seems to me, especially in modern day culture, that young working class women are persuaded, they're fed this dream that they can move out of poverty. It's a bit like winning the lottery. If they make themselves gorgeous enough and sexually desirable enough, they can move upwards socially. Even though really they will always be looked down on in terms of they won't be ladies, but yeah, but they won't be in poverty. And so it wasn't really about judging prostitutes, not in the least, but it was about the idea that for working class women, they are fed this, a bit like the American dream, or if you work hard enough, or if there's certain things you can do to move up socially. But I don't see, it certainly isn't a solution for the majority of working class women, or if it's a solution for any, I don't know. But that's what I was thinking about.
No, I think there's there's a contemporary example of that, you know, with sort of Instagram influencers, Geordie Shore, Only Ways Essex, etc. That there is a particular, you know, working class woman's look. I mean, one of the interesting things about that is that working class women and their connection to beauty and the beauty industry has always been interesting to me, because there's been cottage industries that working class women have set up in their communities for the women in their communities around, you know, nails, tanning, hairdressing, eyelashes, hair extensions, makeup, like Avon, you know, you name it. There's always been sort of cottage industries for working class women around beauty and their body. And so I think, you know, the body of the working class woman, I don't know, is narrated in a very particular way that I don't think the middle class woman does. It is. Our sexuality and our interest in how we look is important to us in how we value each other and ourselves, actually.
I'm going to find Gordon because he's had his hand up for ages. Gordon, do you want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Yes, well, it's more a comment about the kind of double standards you've been talking about. My first wife had a daughter before we were married, and didn't marry, and ended up living with another woman sharing a house who had three children, but didn't live with a boyfriend. And he was middle class and married. And his wife, and of course, Lynn, one with 3 children, had a social worker. And a boyfriend was still married, still lived in the same house. And his wife had an affair and had a child that wasn't his, but had been brought up within the family. They were middle class. The irony was she was a social worker and actually visited friends of her husband's lover as a social worker.
Yeah. I mean,
you know, it's
the contradictions there is it's always the thing I've found with class is not just about the economic inequality between us. There's also inequalities regarding under what moral fibre each one of us are judged. So social workers are always interesting to me, actually. Those of you who are historians will know, like, where the social work practice came from. You know, sort of middle class do-gooding women who was outraged by, you know, the dirt and disease in working class homes. You know, there are lots of arguments about the social workers of the past and the present, you know, but for me, I always found them as, you know, teaching working class women how to be better mothers and better women. And what they meant by better is they meant middle class. And this narrative has gone right through history. There's a great book called The History of the Underclass. I don't know if any of you have come across it, which sort of notes this, how what being a better person means is actually being middle class and taking on middle class values, which is what Mrs. Bouquet does. She gets it wrong. But there's, I mean, when I wrote my PhD, I wrote it very critical of the Blair social exclusion stuff, particularly around Sure Start. Some of you might balk at this, but I always thought that Sure Start was, you know, was another middle class project in order to teach working class women how to be better, with an assumption that working class women's mothering was wrong to start with. And I always was very skeptical about Sure Start, and still am, actually. So yeah, these narratives of the bad working class mother that doesn't know how to mother properly, and we need the middle class women to teach us, it goes right through history and is still with us today.
Gail, are you waving at me? Do you want to unmute?
Hi, yeah. Hi, Lisa. Nice to see you again, and thanks for the talk. I can remember an incident when I was a single parent who happened to be a gay single parent, who then ended up on having my child put on a risk register just basically because of my sexuality. Nothing to do with my parenting skills or anything else. Or I had, and the same with the education department, and me being who I am, I took them on and won. But the point is they came into my home. In fact, the first social worker, I actually grabbed hold of her and threw her out the house. But it is typical, and of course, in the 80s, I mean, we had all the homophobia really come to the fore with the AIDS stuff and whatever. It really showed the bigotry that's within social services about making people better parents. It's a parent can only be as good, particularly a working class parent, can only be as good as the opportunities that they're afforded at the end of the day. It can be, whether it's down to money, whether it's down to education, and providing the best that you possibly can for your child. This woman just could not get it through a thick skull that it wasn't about my sexuality. And she kept on harping on about my sexuality. And I says, I'm quite open, you know, I don't hide my sexuality. I don't exactly, you know, sit there, you know, with a partner, like sorting myself out with her, like in front of a child. But at the same point in time, this woman had an absolute fixation. And in the finish, I ended up going to the top of social services, writing a complaint, went in and demanded to see him. And then I got booted off my case and then got a guy on it who completely was another thing. And the other part of the story really was about when I actually came out, my mother brought the vicar in. So, you know, thinking I was going to be like sort of exercised or something. So it is about class oppression as well. And I mean, I totally recognise, I mean, I used to cry at Mrs. Bouquet and laugh at that programme till my stomach hurt, but it is still going on now. In fact, it's probably more prominent now. It's absolutely blatant. It's in your face compared to what it has been.
I do think that class inequality, class prejudice and classism is nowhere near even on the agenda to be talked about wider in society. And, you know, my argument for that, which I've constantly made, is why would the middle class want to debate or talk about a system that benefits them greatly? Because the class, you know, class system in Britain is relational. It's about the relationship between classes. It's about those power relationships. So therefore, what has too often happened, and particularly through policies and through institutional policies, is that they focus on the working class. What are they doing wrong? What are the things that we can do to make them do the right thing? And it always focuses on the working class as being wrong. What it never does is understands that relationship where you've got the middle class that unfairly and unequally is advantaged by the working class's disadvantage. And you can't talk about that because obviously, you know, middle class people get really upset about that because, you know, they say, well, I've worked really hard. My dad worked really hard, you know, in order to put me through private school, he worked really hard. And it's like, well, my dad worked really hard down the pit as well. But your class advantaged you and mine disadvantaged me. And so in order to talk about class inequality, you have to talk about both. You have to talk about the unfair disadvantages that is attached to being working class, and you have to talk about the unfair advantages attached to being middle class. And that is the thing that we keep getting stuck at. We're all happy to talk about what can we do more for the working class. You know, do we need to raise their aspiration? Do they need parenting lessons? Do they need Sure Start? You know, do we need some sort of schemes to make sure they get into university? We're all always happy to talk about that bit. What we're never happy to talk about is what about the middle class and how they game the system. And so until we can do that, the class debate will never be engaged in, never.
There's a lot of good stuff in the chat here, Liz. You're going to enjoy it. I'm definitely going to forward it to you. Particularly, you'll be pleased to hear somebody saying they were proud to be kicked out of a Sure Start class. But there's quite a theme about working class voices in academia, and people saying that it's really important to hear working class voices, feel like we do belong in academia and other spaces where we often feel we perhaps shouldn't be.
Yeah. I mean, you know, my relationship with working in a university is fraught. I'll be honest. I'm going to be totally honest. It's fraught. 90% of my time, I just think, why am I here? 10% of my time, I think I should be here. But you know, as universities become more and more focused on, you know, a neoliberal system of customer service, and a less of a system about knowledge and education, I'm finding it increasingly difficult, actually. Also, you know, the university is an extremely elite middle class space, and you know, I'm going to be really honest and say it. Working class people, you know, individually they may be welcome, but actually the institution does not welcome working class people in it. They find us difficult, problematic. We don't fit. They don't see that their institution is the problem. They see that we are the problem. And you know, that's not just about it, that's about all sort of middle class institutions, which is why, again, if I could set up my own free university, you know, the free working class people's university, I'd do it tomorrow, because that's where I, you know, I'm interested in Raymond Williams and what he thought about education and working class.
Well, we'll be your library, Lisa. That's for sure.
You always have been.
I think we're getting we might be getting towards the close, but I'm just flicking about just in case anybody has something else they want to say. Yeah, I think we're getting there. Anything else you want to say to sum up, Lisa?
No, just really thank you very much for letting me vent. Really enjoyed this. I feel like I'm among friends. And yeah, you know, let's just keep talking. Let's just keep finding spaces and ways to speak from our own positions and our own experiences. You know, we are often silenced, but you know, one of the good things about sort of these Zoom platforms and that is, you know, we can find some spaces of our own. So well done to the Working Class Movement Library for actually getting this platform together and opening the space up, because you've done that.
Thank you. I'm actually, there's just one coming in, which actually is quite a good one. So we'll just sort of finish with this as the last question. What would you add to the curriculum of your people's working class university?
Oh, do you know what I always used to want? I used to always say I wanted to teach Marxism in community centres. I probably still do want to do that, actually. You know, not so much Marxism as a formal subject, but I don't know, teach class inequality. I remember, you know, being the first time I was in a lecture at University of Nottingham and listening to academics talk about the class system, not learning anything, and because I already knew it, but I just thought that what I knew was wrong. So I'd always thought that, you know, that I'd been brought up in a trade union family, etc. And we always suspected that the system was absolutely working against us, and that my apparent failure, working in a factory, being a teenage mom, living in a council house, that was my failure alone. And you kind of, even though you don't believe it, you kind of accept it. Being at university and listening to an academic saying, actually, the system is against you, that was groundbreaking for me, because it's like, do you know what? I was bloody right all along. So it's not that I was learning anything. It was like I'm being validated for the things that I already knew. So that's what I would do in a people's university, is say to people, your experience, your fears, and your own critical thinking should not be dismissed. You're actually bloody bang on the money.
That's a great note to end on, folks, isn't it? That is really thank you so much, Lisa. You're getting a lot of virtual applause here, and that has been a terrific starting our series of autumn Invisible Histories talks with a real whoosh there, which is absolutely brilliant. A lot of challenging stuff. We're running the talks now weekly until the 9th of December. You can have a browse of all the topics if you look on our What's On page. And next week, which is the 7th of October at 2 o'clock, we've got Dave Wetzel, president of the Labour Land Campaign, and his topic is the historic theft of land and attempts over the centuries to redress this injustice. We've got a really interesting range of things, and of course the great thing about doing them online is we can get people from a distance to come and give the talks, because we've never had a budget to do our talks. Talking of which, if you want to donate to the library, of course there's a donate button on our website. But yeah, we've always run this on a zero budget, and now we can get people from Nottingham, from I'm not sure where Dave's going to be talking to us from, and it doesn't matter, he's going to be there thanks to the power of the internet. So we do hope that we will see you again next week, and once again many thanks to Lisa, and thanks to all of you for your participation. Cheers.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.